In the deepest folds of the Appalachian mountains, where the hollows hold shadows long after the sun has risen, some stories are not told but breathed. They are passed in hushed tones over crackling fires, warnings woven into the fabric of the land itself. Among these legends, none is more chilling, more resolutely whispered than the tale of Ilara May Riddle and the children born of shadow and sin in a place called Blackbriar Hollow. It is a story that begins not with a monster, but with a map and a young surveyor who, in the summer of 1987, was tasked with charting the forgotten veins of West Virginia. He was looking for property lines for forgotten parcels of state land. He was not looking for the Riddles. The Riddle homestead was not on any map he possessed. It was a relic, a scar on the landscape accessible only by a nearly invisible deer trail that snaked through rhododendron thickets so dense they blotted out the sky. The cabin itself seemed to have grown from the earth, its timbers silvered with age, its stone chimney leaning as if weary from a century of secrets. It was there that the surveyor, a man named Thomas Miller, saw something that would unravel a history of deliberate, suffocating isolation. A small face, pale and misshapen, peered from a grimy window pane. Its eyes were too far apart, its forehead too high and narrow. Before Miller could fully process the grotesque image, the face vanished, replaced by the formidable silhouette of a bearded man who stared out with an unnerving, proprietary hostility. The surveyor, feeling a primal dread he could not name, retreated from the hollow, but the image of the child's face was seared into his memory. He filed a report, a single paragraph in a lengthy municipal document, noting a possible undocumented homestead with an unwell child. That single paragraph was a spark thrown into the driest, darkest of tinder. To understand the tragedy that would eventually spill from Blackbriar Hollow, one must travel back more than a century to the year 1881. It was then that Hezekiah Riddle, a man fleeing the perceived corruptions of the post-war world, first laid the stones for that cabin's foundation. He was a preacher of his own gospel, a severe and paranoid patriarch who saw sin in every stranger's face and damnation in the encroaching tendrils of civilization. He brought with him a wife and 2 sons, and he carved out a life from the unforgiving mountainside, governed by a single, terrible doctrine he called the Riddle Covenant. The world outside was a pestilence, and to keep their souls and their blood pure, the Riddles would remain apart. Their blood would not mix with the tainted streams of the lowlands. They would be a chosen people, alone with their God in the high, lonely places. Hezekiah's sons married their first cousins, daughters of a neighboring isolated family, who were eventually absorbed into the Riddles' cloistered world. Their children, in turn, married their own first cousins. With each passing generation, the gene pool of Blackbriar Hollow became less a pool and more a stagnant puddle. The outside world faded from memory into myth. Roads were built in the valleys below, but they meant nothing to the Riddles. Wars were fought, presidents were elected, and technologies bloomed. But in the hollow, time was measured only by the passing of seasons and the births of children, who increasingly bore the subtle and then overt marks of their constricted lineage. They were smaller, their teeth were crooked, and a certain slowness of mind became common. These were seen not as defects, but as signs of their purity, the physical manifestation of their separation from the fallen world. The Riddle Covenant was absolute. Jebediah Riddle, Hezekiah's great-grandson, inherited this legacy not as a tradition, but as a holy mandate. He was born in the hollow, and by the time he was a man, he had never been further than the dilapidated general store 10 miles down the mountain. He was a man of immense physical strength and unshakable conviction, his mind a fortress built of his great-grandfather's scripture and a lifetime of profound ignorance. He saw the world through the lens of a singular, terrifying belief that his family was the last pure vessel of humanity, and he was its appointed guardian. His wife, a distant cousin named Sarah, was a frail woman who bore him a single daughter, Elara May, before succumbing to a fever that no mountain remedy could break. Her death served only to reinforce Jebediah's conviction. The outside world, with its medicines and doctors, was a temptation of the devil. God would provide for the riddles, or he would test them with loss. Elara May grew up in a world defined by the looming presence of her father and the suffocating silence of the hollow. Her only companions were the trees, the creek, and the ghosts of her ancestors, whose stories were her only education. She was taught that she was special, a daughter of a sacred line, and that her duty was to that line above all else. When she blossomed into a young woman, Jebediah was faced with a crisis that threatened the very foundation of his world. There were no other riddles of suitable age for her to marry. The covenant, for the first time in a century, faced an existential threat. To bring in an outsider was unthinkable. To let the riddle line end was a betrayal of God and 4 generations of sacrifice. In his twisted, isolated logic, Jebediah found a grotesque solution, one he justified with cherry-picked and warped verses from the Old Testament. The line had to continue, the blood had to remain pure. And so he turned to his own daughter. The initial report from the surveyor, Thomas Miller, languished for months in a forgotten file cabinet in the county seat. It was only by chance that a new social worker, a determined and empathetic woman named Clara Davies, stumbled upon it while reviewing backlogged land use cases. The phrase "unwell child" snagged her attention. She cross-referenced the coordinates with census data and found a void. No registered births, no school records, no tax payments. It was a ghost property inhabited by ghosts. Driven by a gnawing sense of duty, she decided to investigate. The journey to Blackbriar Hollow was an ordeal. The last few miles required a 4-wheel drive vehicle and then a long, arduous hike. When she finally emerged into the clearing, she felt as though she had stepped back in time. Jebediah Riddle met her at the edge of the woods, a shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm. He was a towering figure, his beard a wild grey thicket, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire. Clara, relying on her training, remained calm and professional. She explained she was from the county, conducting a routine welfare check based on an old report. Jebediah's denial was swift and absolute. He and his daughter, Elara May, lived there alone. They needed nothing from the outside world. He spoke of God's providence and the government's wickedness in the same breath. During the tense conversation, Clara saw Elara May herself, a fleeting figure in the cabin's doorway. She was a woman who looked both too young and too old, her face gaunt, and her eyes holding a deep, haunted emptiness. Clara noticed the subtle but distinct physical traits, the slight droop of her eyelids, the unusual shape of her hands. They were markers of something she couldn't yet place, but they were deeply unsettling. Clara left that day with nothing concrete, but her suspicions had crystallized into a chilling certainty. Something was terribly wrong in Blackbriar Hollow. Clara Davies was not a woman who gave up easily. She began to dig, poring over century-old maps and brittle county records. She found the original land grant deeded to Hezekiah Riddle in 1881. She found marriage licenses from the early 20th century, all between individuals with the surname Riddle or a closely related one. Then after 1948, the records stopped entirely. It was as if the family had ceased to officially exist. Her investigation led her to Silas Blackwood, the proprietor of a dusty general store that served the scattered mountain communities. Silas was an old man, his memory a repository of local law. He remembered Jebediah's father, and he remembered Jebediah as a boy. He spoke of the riddles with a mixture of pity and fear. "They keep to themselves," Silas told Clara, his voice a low rasp. "Always have. They believe the world down here is poison. I remember Jebediah's wife, Sarah. Poor thing, died giving birth to Elara May. Jebediah brought the baby down once for supplies, wrapped in a deerskin, never saw her again till she was a teenager. And there were others before, children you'd hear crying from the woods when the wind was right, but you never saw them. They'd come for salt and flour, but they'd never bring a sick child to a doctor. The mountain just takes them, folks say." This testimony, filled with the chilling ambiguity of folklore, was the final piece Clara needed. The whispers of other children, the ones who were never seen, elevated her concern to an emergency. She presented her findings to a county judge and was granted a court order to enter the Riddle property to ascertain the welfare of any and all minors. The intervention was planned with the caution of a police raid. Clara was accompanied by the county sheriff, a stoic man named Frank Miller, no relation to the surveyor, and a public health nurse named Eleanor Vance. As they approached the clearing, the unnerving silence of the place pressed in on them. Jebediah was waiting, as if he had expected them. This time his defiance was more potent, laced with furious shouted scripture. He brandished his shotgun, declaring them agents of Satan come to defile his holy ground. Sheriff Miller, a veteran of tense standoffs, managed to de-escalate the situation, but Jebediah refused them entry into the cabin. It was only when the sheriff produced the warrant and made it clear he would use force that the old man relented, his face a mask of cold fury. The interior of the cabin was a scene of shocking squalor and poverty. It was dark and smelled of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and something else, something acrid and sickly. But it was the silence that was most disturbing. It was the heavy, deliberate silence of a place where secrets were being actively kept. While the sheriff kept Jebediah occupied, Clara and Eleanor began a methodical search. They saw Elara May huddled in a corner, rocking back and forth, her eyes wide with terror. She did not speak. It was Eleanor who found the trapdoor, hidden beneath a threadbare bearskin rug in the corner of the main room. As she lifted the heavy wooden door, a foul, stale air wafted up from the darkness below. And with it came a sound. It was the sound of a child whimpering. From the root cellar they removed 3 children. The sight of them was so horrific that even the hardened sheriff recoiled. They were small for their ages, which were impossible to guess, and they all bore the same severe, disfiguring facial and cranial abnormalities. Their fingers and toes were fused together in grotesque webbed appendages. They blinked in the sudden light as if they had never seen the sun, their bodies pale and underdeveloped. The truth of Blackbriar Hollow had been dragged from the earth, and it was more monstrous than any legend. The 3 children were immediately transported to the nearest hospital, a journey that represented their first ever contact with the modern world. Their medical evaluation became a case of unprecedented scientific and ethical complexity. They were diagnosed with a constellation of genetic disorders, the most prominent being Appert syndrome, a condition characterized by craniosynostosis, the premature fusion of skull bones, and syndactyly, the fusion of fingers and toes. But the severity of their conditions, the specific and overlapping mutations, were unlike anything the doctors had ever seen. The case was escalated to Dr. Alistair Finch, a leading geneticist at a university medical centre. He suspected that the children's phenotype was the result of extreme consanguinity, but he needed proof. Blood samples were taken from the children from a cooperative Elara May and, by court order, from a belligerent Jebediah Riddle. The laboratory work took 2 weeks, 2 weeks during which the story of the Hollow children began to leak to the press, creating a firestorm of sensationalist media coverage. When Dr. Finch received the final DNA sequencing report, he sat in his office in stunned silence for a full hour. The science was cold, objective, and irrefutable. The genetic markers confirmed a degree of inbreeding so profound it was almost statistically impossible. Jebediah Riddle was not only the children's maternal grandfather, he was also their biological father. Ilara May Riddle was both their mother and their half-sister. The Riddle covenant, in its final, desperate generation, had committed the ultimate taboo to preserve itself. In a sterile interview room, far from the shadows of the Hollow, Ilara May finally began to speak. Her story tumbled out in a broken, halting whisper, a confession from a soul that had never known another reality. She spoke of a life where her father was the voice of God, where his word was the only law she had ever known. She described the twisted religious ceremonies he conducted, anointing her as the chosen vessel to carry the sacred bloodline forward. She did not speak of it as abuse, for she had no framework to understand it as such. To her, it had been a holy duty, a terrible and painful honor. Her narrative was not one of defiance or consent, but of a profound and total indoctrination, a psychological cage built over a lifetime of absolute isolation. The most chilling part of her testimony was the revelation that these 3 were not the only children she had borne. There had been 5 others. "They were born wrong," she whispered, her eyes vacant. "Father said God did not wish for them to stay." He took them up the hill to be with the others. This horrifying admission led investigators back to the Riddle property. Behind the cabin, on a small, overgrown rise, they found it, a makeshift graveyard. There were no stones, only a series of small, sunken depressions in the earth. An excavation, led by a team of forensic anthropologists, uncovered the skeletal remains of over a dozen infants and small children, some dating back generations. The tiny bones told a silent, devastating story. Many showed the same congenital deformities as the living children: malformed skulls, fused vertebrae, twisted limbs. It was a physical record of the Riddle family's century-long descent into genetic collapse, a testament to the deadly consequences of their covenant of purity. The hidden graveyard was the ultimate, grotesque secret of Blackbriar Hollow. The aftermath of the discovery was a maelstrom of legal, ethical, and media chaos. Jebediah Riddle was charged with a litany of crimes, but his trial became a public spectacle that put the very concept of culpability on trial. His defense argued that he was not a monster in the conventional sense, but the product of a closed system, a man whose reality had been shaped by a century of extreme indoctrination and genetic degradation. Was he truly evil, or was he, in his own way, as much a victim of his ancestors as his own children were? Ilara May's legal status was even more complex. She was simultaneously a victim of horrific abuse and a participant in the neglect of her children. The prosecution ultimately granted her immunity in exchange for her testimony against her father, recognizing that she possessed no genuine agency in the choices she had made. The 3 surviving children became wards of the state, their identities shielded from the public. Their integration into the outside world was a painful and largely unsuccessful process. They were nonverbal, terrified of open spaces, and required constant specialized medical care for the rest of their lives. They were living artifacts of a forbidden history, their bodies a testament to a legacy of isolation. The Riddle case became a national symbol, twisted by the media into a caricature of Appalachian life that reinforced every negative stereotype. They were portrayed as feral, ignorant, and subhuman, their complex tragedy flattened into a simple, horrifying headline. For social workers and geneticists, however, the case was a landmark. It led to new state policies regarding outreach to isolated communities and became a crucial, if deeply disturbing, case study in human genetics, cited in textbooks on the devastating effects of long-term inbreeding. 20 years passed, the seasons turned in Blackbriar Hollow, and nature began to reclaim the Riddle homestead. The cabin slowly collapsed, its roof caving in, its walls surrendering to the ivy and the relentless forest. Jebediah Riddle died of a heart attack 7 years into his life sentence in a maximum security prison. He remained defiant and unrepentant to the end, reportedly preaching his family's covenant to any inmate who would listen. The two most severely affected children passed away in their late teens, succumbing to complications from their congenital conditions. The third, a boy they named Adam, survived into his 20s, living in a quiet, dedicated care facility. He never learned to speak, but the nurses said he was calmest when he could sit by a window and watch the trees. And Elara May Riddle, the woman at the heart of the storm, vanished. After years of intensive therapy and education, the state gave her a new name and a new life in a distant town. She lived in quiet obscurity, a ghost haunted by a past that was too heavy to ever fully escape. Some said she worked as a cleaner in a library, surrounded by the silence of books filled with worlds she could never have imagined. Others claimed she simply faded away, unable to bear the weight of her own story. In the mountains of West Virginia, however, she never truly disappeared. Her story calcified into legend. She became the Witch of Blackbriar Hollow, a monstrous figure in a cautionary tale told to frighten children into behaving. The horrific reality of her life, the profound isolation, the suffocating indoctrination, the impossible choices she never had, was lost to the simplicity of folklore. She became a symbol of the darkness that confessed her in the forgotten corners of the world, a chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not born of fantasy, but are forged in the quiet crucibles of secrecy and silence. The truth of Elara May is a far more somber lesson, that a cage does not need to be made of iron, and that the deepest, most inescapable prisons are the ones built within the human mind, generation by painstaking generation.